The order of the Army Group, issued on the evening of September 15th after my return from the Führer's headquarters, to withdraw the armies to the Dnieper, stipulated that the pace of this maneuver was determined by the preservation of the combat-ready troops. It stated verbatim that in all decisions and orders should be based, above all, on the position that combat-ready troops can cope with any difficulties. Troops that have lost combat ability or morale are powerless, especially in retreat. Wherever possible, the armies were encouraged to take the fight to the attacking enemy to weaken his offensive impulse and to gain time for withdrawal. The Sixth Army had the task of withdrawing both of its corps, located on the southern flank, to a prepared position between Melitopol and the Dnieper Arc, south of Zaporozhye. Its northern corps was to withdraw to a fortified bridgehead near Zaporozhye. In this connection it was transferred together with the bridgehead it occupied to the subordination of the 1st Tank Army. The 6th Army was subordinated to Army Group A, the 17th Army of which was withdrawn from the Kuban to the Crimea. The 1st Tank Army had the task to cross the Dnieper at Zaporozhye and Dnepropetrovsk to take positions from Zaporozhye to the area 30 km east of Kremenchug. After the crossing, the Dnepropetrovsk bridgehead was to be abandoned, while the Zaporozhye bridgehead had to be held by Hitler's categorical order. The right flank corps of the 8th Army, also retreating to Dnepropetrovsk, was subordinated to the 1st Tank Army. This army further was ordered to concentrate as early as possible 40 TK, consisting of 2 panzer divisions, 1 motorized division, and the SS Cavalry Division in the area south of the Dnieper for transfer to the left flank of the Army Group. This plan, however, was thwarted by Hitler's order to hold the Zaporozhye bridgehead. On the consequences of this step I will discuss below. The 8th Army had the task to cross the Dnieper in the area of the Kremenchug and Cherkasy fortified bridgeheads. The army had to fight, concentrating large forces of tanks on the left flank to provide an opportunity to withdraw to the crossing at Cherkasy. Since the army had to occupy positions behind the Dnieper up to a point 30 km south of Kiev, the 24th Tank Army, which was withdrawing to the Dnieper as part of the 4th Tank Army through Kiev, after reaching the Dnieper was subordinated to the 8th Army. The 4th Tank Army had the task to cross the above-mentioned corps near Kiev and the main forces of the army near Kiev, and to ensure the establishment of communication across the Dnieper with the right flank of Army Group Center, located to the north. The withdrawal to the line Melitopol-Dnieper under the onslaught of superior enemy forces started in accordance with this order is probably the most difficult operation conducted by the Army Group during the campaign of 1943 to 1944. It was relatively easy to solve this problem on the right flank, where the 6th Army was. It managed to withdraw its troops in a straight line to the prepared positions north of Melitopol and to the Zaporozhye bridgehead. On this section of the front, the danger lay mainly in the onslaught of superior enemy forces, especially tanks, which were striking at our retreating troops. It was exceptionally difficult, however, to withdraw the 3 remaining armies and cross the river. There were only 5 crossings of the Dnieper River in the 700 kilometers of the front. After the crossing, the armies had to turn around again and take up the defense on a front of the same width, before the enemy could seize bridgeheads on the southern bank. Just the mere fact that each army had to concentrate its forces at 1 or 2 crossings already gave the enemy a great chance. But the main danger was that the enemy could use the time that was necessary for the crossing of German troops at Dnepropetrovsk, Kremenchug, Cherkasy, Kiev and Kiev, in order to strike between these crossings and force the Dnieper. The withdrawal of these armies was further complicated by the fact that the entire central section of the front occupied by the Army Group, the left flank of the 1st Tank Army, and the 8th Army could not withdraw to the Dnieper in a straight line. They had to be withdrawn further north of the river, almost parallel to it, to the west, to reach the crossings, the use of which could ensure the timely occupation of defensive positions across the river, across the width of the front of the Army Group. The most difficult was the 8th Army, which had to fight its way to its western crossing near Cherkasy only during the retreating march. On the left flank of Army Group, where was the 4th Army, there was another danger, which consisted in the fact that as a result of the development of events on the southern flank of Army Group Center, it could be cut off from Kiev. The fact that this extremely difficult withdrawal succeeded, although not without complications in some areas, is a credit to the flexible management of artillery and the consequence of excellent discipline of the troops. Only a command that knew that it was superior to the enemy command, only troops who, retreating, were aware that they were not defeated, could accomplish this task. The enemy failed to disrupt troop concentrations at the few river crossings or to cut them off from those crossings. Despite his numerical superiority, he was not able to use the favourable situation which created for him pulling our troops to the crossings in order to force the Dnieper with large forces away from these crossings and thus prevent the creation of the planned defensive line on the other side of the river. The fact that he seized in several sections bridgeheads on the opposite side of the river, with the lack of forces on our side, could not be prevented. I will dwell on this further. Extremely difficult conditions in which this manoeuvre was carried out forced the German command to resort to any measures that would make it difficult for the enemy to pursue our troops. It was necessary to prevent the enemy immediately after entering the Dnieper non-stop to continue his offensive, moving to it immediately after the pursuit. For this reason, the German side had to resort to the tactic of scorched earth. In the zone of 20 to 30 kilometers in front of the Dnieper River, everything that could help the enemy to immediately continue his offensive on a wide front on the other side of the river was destroyed or taken to the rear, that is, everything that could be a shelter or cantonment place for him when concentrating forces in front of our Dnieper positions, and everything that could facilitate his supply, especially the food supply of his troops. At the same time, by special order of Göring's economic staff, stores, household goods, and machines that could be used for war production were removed from the area we were leaving. This action, however, was carried out by the Army Group only with regard to war machines, non-ferrous metals, grain and technical crops, as well as horses and cattle. The plundering of these areas was naturally out of the question. In the German army, in contrast to the rest of the world, plundering was not tolerated. Strict controls were established to ensure that no illegal cargo of any kind could be taken out. The property or supplies we took out of factories, warehouses, state farms, etc., by the way, constituted public and not private property. Since the Soviets in the regions they had recaptured from us immediately mobilized all able-bodied men up to the age of 60 into the army and used the entire population without exception, even in the area of the fighting, for work of a military nature, and the general command of the German army ordered the local population to be transported across the Dnieper. In reality, however, this coercive measure applied only to the conscripts who would have been immediately drafted. But a large part of the population voluntarily followed our retreating units to get away from the Soviets, whom they feared. Long columns formed, which we later had to see also in eastern Germany. The armies gave them all kinds of help. They were not hijacked but were sent to areas west of the Dnieper, where German headquarters took care of their accommodation and supplies. The fleeing population had the right to take with them both horses and cattle, everything that could be taken out. We provided the population also, as far as possible, with transportation. That the war brought them much suffering and inevitable hardship cannot be disputed. But they could not be compared with what the civilian population in Germany suffered from the terrorist bombings and what later happened in eastern Germany. In any case, all the measures taken by the German side were explained by military necessity. What an exceptional technical achievement this retreating maneuver was, a few figures can illustrate. We had to transport only about 200,000 wounded. The total number of railroad trains which carried military and evacuated property was about 2,500. The number of civilians who joined us was probably several 100,000. This withdrawal was made in a relatively short period of time, and given the very limited number of crossings of the Dnieper in particularly difficult conditions. Contrary to all previous ideas, this withdrawal proved that such operations can be carried out in a short period of time. On September 30th, all armies that were part of our army group were on the line Melitopol-Dnieper. Having crossed the Dnieper, the army group was separated from the enemy, of course, a strong natural barrier. However, it was clear that for a long time to count on the cessation of hostilities cannot. The enemy, we were convinced, would seek, as before, solutions in this section of the Eastern Front, and not elsewhere. He still saw here before him the most tempting operational, military, economic and political objectives. He would therefore, to the limit of using its resources on the southern flank, throw against Army Group South all new forces, whether from the reserves or from other parts of the front, Naturally, he will, in addition, and in other areas will undertake, and on other parts of the offensive with a private goal or restraining strikes. But the decisive importance of these strikes, even if they in some areas and lead to success, compared to the actions on the southern wing of the Eastern Front, obviously cannot have. What chance to hold the front had Army Group South? Was it possible to count on the fact that the enemy would finally exhaust its forces in the fruitless attacks of the Dnieper defensive line? This question could have been answered with much more confidence in the fall of 1944 if the Dnieper frontier had been well equipped for defence. However, this was not the case. True, the Army Group Command in the winter of 1942/43 demanded from the OK to equip the Dnieper frontier as quickly as possible. It itself could not do this work because the Dnieper region was not yet part of the front zone. Hitler, however, rejected this demand, firstly because he considered the equipment of rear positions a great temptation for the troops, which in this case would look more backward than forward, secondly, because he wanted to throw all the forces and, above all the funds for the construction of the Atlantic rampart. In spite of this, the Army Group, as the front approached the Dnieper in early 1944, on its own initiative began to strengthen bridgeheads near Zaporozhye, Dnepropetrovsk, Kremenchug and Kiev, in order at least to deprive the enemy of the possibility of cutting our rear communications at the important crossings across the Dnieper that existed there. When, after the termination of the Operation Citadel, began the final transition to defence, the headquarters of the group immediately began to equip the entire Dnieper frontier. The work was carried out on a wide front with the involvement of the civilian population. Nevertheless, only light field-type positions could be established. The Army Group had to obtain construction vehicles, as well as the most important building materials: concrete, steel, barbed wire and mines from the supply line through the OK, and timber from the Reichskommissariat of Ukraine. Hitler, however, still favoured the Atlantic rampart first. Thus, the Dnieper frontier, at least until the river froze over, could be considered a powerful line of defence, if, of course, only it were possible to occupy it with a large enough force as needed for field positions. In this, however, as before, lay the weakness of the German army. The numerical strength of the German formations had been reduced in appalling proportions by the continuous fighting of the last 2.5 months. The incoming replenishment in men, light and heavy weapons, and above all, in tanks could not even approximately make up for the losses. To a large extent, this was due to the fact that Hitler, as mentioned earlier, demanded the formation of more and more new divisions in the rear. Army Group headquarters during the withdrawal to the Dnieper in detail reported to the OK about the situation with the numerical composition of the compounds of the group. On the basis of this report, we could conclude that we obviously would not be able to hold the Dnieper frontier for a long time. We then emphasized that the defense of the river itself should be entrusted to the infantry divisions, while the tank formations should be kept as a mobile reserve so that they could timely come to the aid where the enemy would try to force the river with superior forces. Group headquarters in this regard reported that in the 3 remaining armies, taking into account the arrival of 3 divisions still on the march, it has directly for the defence of the Dnieper frontier, a length of 700 km, a total of 37 infantry divisions. Thus, each division had to defend a strip 20 km wide. The average strength of the divisions of the first echelon, however, is currently only 1,000 men. After the arrival of the promised replenishment, it will be no more than 2,000 men. It was clear that with such an available composition cannot be organised a stable defence even behind such a border as the Dnieper. Regarding the 17 armoured and motorised divisions, which are now available to the Army Group, the report stated that none of them does not have full combat capability. The number of tanks decreased as much as the numerical composition. Army Group Command therefore demanded that following the arrival of 3 divisions were sent more new compounds. It believed that it had the right to do so, especially since the front of Army Group Centre, after the withdrawal to the Dnieper, was reduced by 1/3. It was also impossible to assume that the enemy, at least on the southern flank of this group, would undertake a major offensive because it would lead him into the Pinsk swamps. It was equally important, it was further said, that the formations of Army Group South would first of all receive replenishment of men and equipment. They, as before, would bear the brunt of the fighting on the Eastern Front. nor was not to repeat such a situation with a shortage of ammunition, which was observed during the retreat. The report ended with the conclusion that on the fulfillment of these requirements depended the possibility, as a result of the fighting on the Dnieper line, to stop the enemy's advance. In the final analysis, the question was whether the general command of the German army at that time had the means and forces to successfully conduct combat operations on that section of the Eastern Front, where the enemy in 1944 sought to achieve decisive success. At that time, it could not yet be said that such a task, due to the large overall superiority of the Soviets in the number of formations in advance, doomed to failure. Even if the enemy had decided this year to throw all forces to achieve success on the southern flank, the transportation possibilities would have put him certain limits to the use of his forces on this flank. It was necessary, therefore, that the general command of the German army to prepare for the expected offensive of the enemy, timely and in sufficient numbers to concentrate here the necessary forces for this purpose. Of course, this was only possible if it had decided to take great risks for the sake of it in other parts of the Eastern Front and theatres of war. In the event that this had happened, it could be assumed that the collapse of the Soviet offensive on the front of Army Group South would have meant the exhaustion of the offensive impulse of the Soviets. And such a success could have been decisive for the further course of hostilities. Around this question of the timely strengthening of the southern flank of the Eastern Front with sufficient forces and unfolded in the future struggle between the Army Group Command and the General Command. I want, however, to refuse to describe the content of the repeated negotiations between us and the General Command on this subject. It is only necessary to note that the Chief of the General Staff and the Operational Directorate were quite in agreement with us on this question. Thus, on October 3rd, General Husinger told me that he proposed to leave the Crimea and withdraw Army Group North to a shorter front line in order to free up forces here for Army Group South. He also made a proposal somewhere deeper in the rear to equip a real eastern rampart. But the Führer rejected both the proposal to surrender Crimea and the withdrawal of Army Group North and the construction of an eastern rampart in the rear. He said that he was considering only the possibility of transferring formations from other theatres of war. But even in this case, if the issue is resolved positively, we can only talk about a small number of compounds. Already at the end of September, the enemy's intentions to resume the offensive in order to force the Dnieper. Large enemy forces followed the 6th Army, which since the middle of the month passed into the subordination of Army Group A and withdrew to the line Melitopol Dnieper. 2 enemy armies in the first echelon and another one in the second echelon, with a total of 20 rifle divisions and 2 tank or mechanized corps, followed the 1st Tank Army in the direction of the Zaporozhye bridgehead. 2 armies with 15 rifle divisions, followed by a tank army with 3 corps, were advancing toward the Dnieper between Dnipropetrovsk and Kremenchug. 2 armies with about 12 rifle divisions, 2 tank corps and 1 mechanized corps, followed by a tank army also with 3 corps, moved to the Dnieper between Cherkasy and Rozyshev. In the direction to Kiev and the section of the Dnieper north of the city, so far was detected the approach of only 3 infantry corps and 1 mechanized corps of the enemy. Obviously, the enemy wanted to strike first the main blow on the Dnieper arc. However, just to the area on both sides of Kiev, the enemy could most likely transfer its forces from the central section of the front. Although the Army Group managed by September 30th to withdraw its forces in the difficult situation described above across the Dnieper, it could not prevent the enemy from seizing 2 bridgeheads on the southern bank of the river. He managed to cut in on both sides of the junction between the 8th Army and the 1st Tank Army in the middle of the section between Dnipropetrovsk and Kremenchug. The troops located on the south bank were too weak and were unable to prevent the crossing. In order to counterattack the enemy on the opposite bank, there was not enough 40 TK, on the allocation of which as a mobile reserve south of the Dnieper, at one time was ordered by the commander of the Army Group. 40 TK was still on the Zaporozhye bridgehead. Hitler, as mentioned above, during the withdrawal ordered to hold the Zaporozhye, Dnipropetrovsk, Kremenchug and Kiev bridgeheads. There would be nothing to object to this order if the Army Group had enough forces for defence. Since this, however, was not the case, the command of the Army Group envisaged leaving these bridgeheads after the end of the crossing. With our order regarding the last 3 bridgeheads, Hitler silently agreed. As for even recently expanded Zaporozhye bridgehead, he categorically ordered despite all objections, to hold it. He cited as justification for his order the necessity to hold the large Dnieper dam together with its power station, and also the consideration that the enemy would hardly dare to attack the Sixth Army in the area of Melitopol while this bridgehead was in our hands. The latter consideration from the operational point of view deserved attention. However, Hitler again chased too many targets at once. The consequence of this order to hold Zaporozhye was, in any case, that the First Tank Army could not timely release 40 TK. Thus there was no possibility to destroy by counterattack the enemy who had crossed the Dnieper between Dnepropetrovsk and Kremenchug, and meanwhile he had accumulated large forces on the new bridgehead, expanded it and kept it for himself. The enemy managed to create a second bridgehead also in late September, using the bend of the Dnieper south of Pereyaslav, west of the crossing at Kiev. Apparently he wanted to create a large bridgehead here. At least 4 tank corps and 1 mechanized corps were concentrated here, accumulating on both sides of the Dnieper bend. The enemy dropped several parachute brigades south of the river and pulled together 8 rifle divisions and 1 tank corps into the narrow bend of the river within a short time. A threatened situation also developed on the extreme northern flank of the army group. The enemy managed to force the Desna between the 4th Tank Army and Army Group Center, although the order was to hold the Desna frontier at first. The order given in due time by OK about allocation of forces by the 2nd Army for defense of this line was not fulfilled. In the middle of September, the headquarters of the army group was transferred from Zaporozhye to Kirovograd, a large city, the capital of the region, the borders of which are described by the large Dnieper arc. From there I went to the sections of the Dnieper frontier that were threatened the 1st Tank Army, the 8th Army, and also to the Kiev area. The impression I had at that time was as follows: 4 Tank Army obviously will hold its position, but the threat at the junction between the other 2 armies is unlikely to be completely eliminated. In early October, the Army Group headquarters moved to a more conveniently located for the management of operations former Führer's headquarters in Vinnytsia. It was located in the woods, and in due course a great deal of money had been expended on its equipment. It had its own water supply and power plant. It housed Hitler and the headquarters of the OKB. The working and living quarters we now occupied were finished and furnished simply but tastefully in wooden houses. We were struck by the system of dugouts for sentries dug into the ground, hidden away, which ran around the entire forest camp. Hitler obviously wanted to be guarded, but the guards themselves had to remain invisible to him. We, fortunately, had no reason to guard ourselves in this way. The rear department was located in the former OK premises in the city itself. Vinnytsia is a picturesquely situated large spa town on the Bug River, whose spa facilities were now occupied by hospitals. As far as my work allowed me, I visited the wounded. I can state that the doctors and nurses treated our wounded with great dedication, and the equipment of the hospitals met all requirements. Already in October 1944, the army group was engaged in heavy fighting for the Dnieper frontier. While in the northern parts of the Eastern Front the rains fell in late fall, and there came a period of thawing, which made it difficult for the Soviets to carry out major operations, the situation was different in the south. Here the struggle, on the contrary, continued with unrelenting vigor. In accordance with the grouping of enemy forces, which was revealed as early as the end of September, on the section of the front occupied by the army group, there were 4 areas where the enemy was active. Zaporozhye bridgehead, the liquidation of which the enemy evidently considered a prerequisite for continuing the offensive against the 6th Army positions adjoining it from the south. Both areas on the south bank of the Dnieper, where the enemy managed to create bridgeheads, and finally, the area on the northern flank of the 4th Tank Army north of Kiev. After in early October it was possible to repel strong enemy attacks on the Zaporozhye bridgehead, the enemy resumed its offensive, pulling up new forces. After the artillery preparation, equal to which in terms of intensity of fire we have not yet noted from his side, the enemy force of up to 10 divisions with the support of a large number of tanks managed to wedge into our bridgehead. After heavy fighting we had to leave it. Although we managed to withdraw the forces defending the bridgehead across the Dnieper, as well as to blow up the railroad bridge, which had been rebuilt only a few months before, and to cross the dam, the divisions defending the bridgehead were badly damaged. Whether their forces would be sufficient to defend the river itself was now uncertain. Under pressure from Hitler's attempt to hold the bridgehead cost us, in any case very expensive. On the enemy bridgehead between Dnieper and Kremenchug, as a result of the mobile reserves of the 1st Tank and 8th Armies, we initially managed to stop the advancing enemy, but we could not throw him off the southern bank. He moved here more and more new forces to expand and deepen the bridgehead. I will still dwell on how events developed here, which became decisive for the operations on the Dnieper bulge. At the same time, the enemy tried, throwing into battle large forces, to expand the bridgehead, captured by him on the left flank of the 8th Army in the bend of the Dnieper near Pereyaslav. However, the actions of mobile formations of the 8th and 4th Tank Armies managed to repel the enemy's attempts to force the Dnieper on a wide front and destroy the crossed units. The same fate befell the parachute brigades landed by the enemy here and southwest of Cherkasy. Thus, in this area he remained on his narrow bridgehead south of Pereyaslav under our control. Besides, it was very difficult for him to get away from here. In the area of operations of the 4th Tank Army, the enemy managed during October to seize a bridgehead directly north of Kiev, on the western bank of the river. He also succeeded in following his success on the right flank of the 2nd Army adjoining us from the north to cross the river on a wide front, in the strip occupied by the northernmost corps of this army. In this section revealed the danger, which by experience always exists at the junction between the two compounds. As before, the measures taken by the Army Group to restore the situation at the junction with the 2nd Army were not carried out because it did not comply with the order issued for this purpose on the allocation and transfer of forces necessary for this operation and used them in other areas. Even my persistent protests to the OK did not lead to the fact that it achieved the fulfillment of its order. 4 Tank Army still managed to hold in the strip occupied by the corps north of Kiev, the upland located west of the Dnieper, at a distance of several kilometers from the river. Nevertheless, the situation here continued to be threatening, as it was necessary to take into account the possibility of the enemy bypassing Kiev from the north, as soon as he would be able to move here new forces. However, first of all, we were worried about the fact that these first battles for the Dnieper frontier required us to use all the mobile formations of the Army Group. Their forces were spent every day more and more, as well as the forces of the infantry divisions drawn into the battle. To create new mobile reserves in view of this became more and more difficult, and the arrival of new forces more and more urgent. Army Group Command still considered its northern flank as decisive. If the enemy was able to break the troops on it, the way for a deep coverage of Army Group South and Army Group South and Army Group would be open. In reality, the enemy, apparently, sought to focus their main efforts to achieve success in the Dnieper arc. This situation, as well as Hitler's demand, at all costs, to hold the Dnieper frontier and the Crimea for military, economic and political reasons, forced the Army Group Command to take a decisive battle in the Dnieper arc. Throughout October, the enemy's steppe front, whose command was probably the most energetic on the enemy's side, transferred more and more forces to the bridgehead it had captured south of the Dnieper at the junction between the 1st Tank and 8th Armies. By the end of October, he located here no less than 5 armies, which included 61 rifle divisions and 7 tank and mech corps, numbering more than 900 tanks. Before such a superiority of forces, the inner flanks of both armies could not resist and began to withdraw to the east and west, respectively. Between the armies formed a wide passage. Before the enemy was open the way deep into the Dnieper arc to Krivoy Rog, and thus to Nikopol, the possession of which Hitler from a military and economic point of view considered extremely important. Above all, however, the further advance of the enemy was to lead to the fact that the 1st Panzer Army will be cut off in the eastern part of the Dnieper arc. This last danger for the Army Group Command was the most threatening. It could not under any circumstances to allow the encirclement of this army. Meanwhile, our urgent requests for the transfer of new forces to us led to the fact that the OK allocated for us 2 replenished tank divisions, as well as 1 infantry division. 3 more tank divisions were promised. The final decision on this issue and the date of their arrival, however, was still unclear. The situation would have been very different if these 5 tank formations had been allocated to the Army Group 4 weeks earlier, when they arrived on the Dnieper. Or, if this was not possible because of the need to replenish them, what operational possibilities would have been given to the Army Group Command if it had been able to count on these forces in advance, and at the same time would have had freedom of maneuver on its right flank? In the present situation, we did not even have the right to wait for the arrival of all these 5 tank divisions. By this time, the fate of the 1st Tank Army could already be decided. We had to decide, therefore, to have at our disposal 2 tank divisions and 1 infantry division to counterattack the enemy. As part of the 40 TK, these forces were to strike from the bent-back flank of the 8th Army from the west in the flank and rear of the enemy troops advancing in the direction of Krivoy Rog. 1 tank army, for its part, was to throw all available tanks and infantry towards the enemy in order to maintain its vital link through Krivoy Rog. To ensure this blow, the Army Group Command ordered to leave in the strip occupied by 30 AC, on the Dnieper, on both sides of the Dnieper-Petrovsk, only the guard on the river itself. The main forces of this corps were to withdraw to a shortened front line, the area north of Zaporozhye, the area north of Krivoy Rog, to release the compounds needed for action on the decisive section. Hitler was forced to submit to the circumstances and reconcile with giving up part of the Dnieper frontier. Counterstrike struck in late October in the area north of the Krivoy Rog, which was already facing the enemy. Thanks to the exemplary cooperation of both armies involved in it, gave excellent results. The enemy's plan to cut off the 1st Tank Army in the eastern part of the Dnieper Arc was thwarted. He was seriously defeated. Along with very heavy losses of men, in our hands got 350 tanks and over 350 guns, as well as 5,000 prisoners. These figures, compared to previous data on prisoners and trophies, testified to the extremely rapid growth of technical equipment of the Soviet Army. In any case, 2 to 3 tank and mechanized corps and 8 rifle divisions were defeated, and the remaining compounds suffered significant losses. It was possible again to restore a continuous front between the 1 tank and 8 armies. In order to push back the enemy on the northern bank of the Dnieper, however, the forces were not enough, as the enemy continued to have a significant superiority. The question of this could arise only after the arrival of promised us 3 more tank divisions, and that only if before that time will not create a threatening situation in other areas, which did not take long to wait. While the danger directly threatening the 1st Tank Army was eliminated, in its rear there was a new, even more serious danger. On October 28th, the enemy launched an offensive with vastly superior forces on the front of the 6th Army, which was part of Army Group A, and held a section of the front between the Dnieper and the coast of the Sea of Azov. He managed to realize a deep breakthrough. As a result, the 6th Army for us unexpectedly quickly was withdrawn to the west. Its northern flank withdrew to a large bridgehead south of the Dnieper, which covered, at least temporarily, the rear of the 1st Army and at the same time the area of Nikopol. The rest of the army moved further to the west in the direction of the crossing of the Dnieper at Berislav and the lower course of the Dnieper. True, the Nogai Steppe did not give the army the opportunity to gain a foothold anywhere earlier. Such a development of events on the front of the 6th Army meant a serious danger for the 1st Tank Army located in the eastern part of the Dnieper Arc. If, as a result of counterattack of 40 TTA on the enemy, who broke through to Krivoy Rog and managed to temporarily strengthen the position of this army, it did not mean that the enemy suffered a decisive defeat. The main blow, which the army group planned to strike, could not be realized earlier than mid-November, because the 3 tank divisions promised to us could not arrive earlier to us. Until then, however, the southern flank of the 6th Army would probably have been pushed back behind the lower reaches of the Dnieper, the 17th Army would have been cut off in the Crimea, and the enemy would have had the opportunity to strike from the south across the Dnieper on either side of Nikopol to the rear of the 1st Tank Army. The situation on the front of this army, which was now on a narrow section extending eastward to Zaporozhye with a front to the north and east, would then be very unstable. If this could not be prevented, there was nothing left but to withdraw the 1st Tank Army from the eastern part of the Dnieper Arc to the west. This would mean that one way or another we give the Dnieper Arc, in any case, deprived of Nikopol with its deposits of manganese ore, and give the Crimea to his fate. In order to prevent such a development of events, and above all to avoid creating a threat to the 1st Tank Army from the rear, I propose to oak the following operational solution. 40 TK should, after the end of the battle at Kryvyi Rog, suddenly strike 2, and if possible 3 tank divisions from the bridgehead south of Nikopol, still held by the 6th Army, on the northern flank of the enemy forces pursuing the 6th Army through the Nogai Steppe in the direction of the lower course of the Dnieper. The task of this strike was to provide the 6th Army the opportunity to gain a foothold in front of the Dnieper and to maintain communication with the 17th Army in the Crimea. At the same time, it would eliminate the threat to the 1st Tank Army from the rear. No later than November 12th, the Corps should then be concentrated north of the Dnieper, so that together with the 3 tank divisions arriving at that time to take part in the strike planned here in the area of operations of the 1st Tank Army. If this strike had achieved the expected major success, it would be possible to make another strike with all the tank formations at our disposal in the area of operations of the 6th Army, which would give it the opportunity to again reach the line Melitopol-Dnieper. This proposal was of course enthusiastically accepted by Hitler. After all, it promised him to save Nikopol and the Crimea. Before the implementation of this plan, however, the matter did not come, because the 6th Army was so quickly withdrawn behind the lower reaches of the Dnieper that the strike 40 TK from the bridgehead at Nikopol did not promise any success. Then the events on the northern flank of the army group did not allow the use in the Dnieper arc still on the march of 3 armoured divisions. It would therefore be unnecessary to dwell on this plan, if it did not contain an important lesson. That lesson is that even if it is necessary to seek an operational exit, never, even temporarily, must not lose sight of the basic intent of their operations. The Army Group Command constantly gave primary attention to its northern flank. It was possible to foresee that here in the near future the enemy will again undertake a major offensive. Thus, in the spirit of the general operational concept would be to preempt the enemy in this place and disrupt the implementation of his plans. For this purpose, after a successful blow 40 TK at Kryvyi Rog, it was necessary to withdraw it from the Dnieper arc and move behind the northern flank of the group, from where it was possible to strike together with the approaching 3 new tank divisions. In connection with the further development of hostilities on the front of the 6th Army, obviously would still have to withdraw 1 tank army from the eastern part of the Dnieper arc. The consequence of this would inevitably be the surrender of Nikopol and the abandonment of the Crimea. Hitler, of course, would not agree with this plan, because he specifically allocated to the Army Group 5 panzer divisions to restore the situation in the Dnieper arc. He would still insist on trying to hold the Dnieper arc and the Crimea. This changes nothing in the fact that the Army Group had to act as described above. The proposal I made was correct when taking into account the threatening position of the 1st Tank Army in the spirit of the general plan of operations of the Army Group wrong. It led to the fact that 40 TK remained in the Dnieper arc. If I acted contrary to my own operational concept with my proposal, there were 2 reasons for this. The first of them was the hope that if we retained the Dnieper frontier on both sides of Nikopol, we would be able to strike the enemy with fresh tank formations on one or the other side of the river. These tempting operations on the inner lines, if successful, could lead to the restoration of the position on the southern flank. On the other hand, it was for me and my comrades, who together with me at one time participated in the heavy fighting of the 11th Army for the Crimea, the thought that it will inevitably be surrendered again, if we do not decide to this operation, was very heavy. Still, it would be more correct even temporarily not to abandon the view that the northern flank of the Army Group from an operational point of view was more important. At this critical moment there was a change of commander of the 1st Tank Army. Colonel General von Mackensen was transferred to Italy to take command of another army there. Both he and I were very sorry that we had to part after so long working together in an atmosphere of mutual trust. His successor was General Hube, an experienced frontline soldier who had lost an arm in the First World War, during which he had served as an infantry officer. This did not prevent him, however, from competing successfully in equestrian competitions in later years. He enjoyed a good reputation as an educator of the officer corps, but he did not have the specialized education necessary for service in the higher headquarters. At Stalingrad he commanded a corps. He was a vivacious, energetic man. Unfortunately, in 1944, he was killed in an airplane crash after being presented with diamonds to the Knight's Cross in Obersalzberg. In early November, the enemy in large forces again went on the offensive on the northern flank of the Army Group, a section of the front of the 4th Tank Army on the Dnieper. It was unclear whether this offensive had far-reaching goals or whether the enemy was still trying to occupy the necessary bridgehead west of the Dnieper. Soon it turned out that the 4th Tank Army would not be able to hold its strip on the Dnieper in front of the onslaught of the enemy with a significant superiority of forces. Already on November 5th it was clear that Kiev would be surrendered. Army Group Command would have to throw all available units and, first of all, the 3 panzer divisions on the way to the northern flank of the Army Group. However, since Hitler had instructed to use these divisions only in the area of the lower reaches of the Dnieper, it was necessary to obtain the consent of the OK. If it could not transfer new large forces in the area of operations of the 4th Panzer Army, there was nothing else but to leave the Dnieper arc. Since the decision on this fundamentally important issue could not be obtained, on November 7th, I flew myself to the Führer's headquarters. During our conversation, Hitler said that he did not intend to miss that first and only one-of-a-kind chance, which gives him the proposal of the Army Group to act in the band of the 6th Army to hold the Crimea. He said that at Kiev we cannot achieve such a decisive success, which would give us the opportunity to remove from this area of tanks and move them to the southern flank. We would then not be able to hold either the Crimea or our defences along the lower Dnieper. In response, I noted that if we stick to the battle plan in the Dnieper arc or in the strip of the 6th Army, then not too much risk in doing so on our northern flank, and thus on the entire section of the front of Army Group South and A. No matter how hard it is for me to refuse to strike south of the lower Dnieper, now it is still necessary to use all 3 incoming divisions in the Kiev area. Hitler replied that for military and political reasons, the victory that we can win on the lower reaches of the Dnieper must be achieved. It is necessary to show the army again that it can still make successful strikes. Further, the imperative necessity of keeping in our hands militarily and economically important manganese deposits in the Nikopol area must also be taken into account. The enemy must not get the Crimea, which he uses as a springboard for air operations against the Romanian oil fields. I insisted that, although Hitler's arguments seem very valid, the risk on our northern flank is very great. If the 4th Panzer Army trembles, sooner or later the fate of Army Group South will be decided. Hitler agreed that the risk is great, however, stated that in the current situation it must be taken. He is ready to take it on himself. Still, I managed to achieve that he promised to transfer to our northern flank already repeatedly promised me 4 TD from the 2 Army, the SS Brigade Nordland, and later another 2 parachute division. He agreed to use not 125 TD, and both other tank divisions in the area of operations of the 4th Tank Army, not on the Dnieper bulge. However, but both tank divisions 40 TK were to remain in the 1 Tank Army. The question of striking in the area of operations of the 6th Army remained open. However, these divisions could not be released from this area, as Hitler did not want to withdraw the 1st Panzer Army from the Dnieper arc, where a dangerous situation was created as he sought to hold Nikopol and the Crimea. In the following days, the situation on the front of the 4 Panzer Army quickly began to take a threatening character. 11 infantry divisions of this army, which in their personnel almost without exception equal to regiments, could no longer hold the superior forces of the enemy, who threw into battle already in the first echelon of 17 to 20 infantry divisions of full strength, 3 to 4 tank corps, and 1 cavalry corps. 2 tank divisions, which were in the corps preserve, were also too weak to stop the enemy who had broken through. After heavy fighting, Kiev was abandoned, as the 7AC operating there was in danger of being surrounded in the city. The corpus was thrown from Kiev to the south, and it managed to delay the enemy's advance only 50 km below the city. Only by transferring to this area 10 MTD of the 8th Army, we managed to prevent further withdrawal of troops in this section of the front to the east. On the western flank of the 7th Army, we lost the important railroad junction of Fastov for unloading of suitable forces and supplying the 8th Army. Both corps, standing on the Dnieper north of Kiev, were pushed far to the east 13AC Sitomir and 49AC to Korostan. Both of these important railroad junctions, through which communication with Army Group Centre was carried out, as well as the supply of the Tank Army, were occupied by the enemy. The 4th Panzer Army was thus torn into 3 far-apart groups. The only bright spot in this critical situation was that the enemy had now also fragmented his forces, operating in two directions, south and west. At the same time, the enemy forces advancing westward could not achieve decisive success until they could turn southward to deeply encircle the army group. The task of the two corps thrown back to the west was to prevent them from making this maneuver until the army group would not pull up reinforcements. However, we were destined to live many more anxious days, until by mid-November, the army group was not able to implement its planned countermeasures. They consisted in a counterattack, which was to be carried out by 3 fresh tank divisions arriving to us under the general leadership of the headquarters of the 48th TK in the direction of the advancing from Kiev to the southwest tank formations of the enemy. This group of the enemy at that moment posed the greatest threat. After that, the corps had to turn to the west to break the enemy pursuing the 13th Army in the direction of Zhytomyr. In case of success in this area, it might still be possible to strike a blow in the rear of the group of enemy troops moving from Kiev to the south along the Dnieper. To further strengthen the 4th Panzer Army Group transferred to it from the 8th Army 2 more tank and 2 motorized divisions, as well as 10 and 8 PD. It was clear that by doing so we weakened the 8th Army beyond all measure, but the Army Group was at that moment forced to significantly weaken the less important parts of the front and transfer their forces to the decisive section. Unfortunately, the Army Group also had to transfer 25 TD, which was in the group's reserve, to the strike on Fastov in order to secure the area of deployment of the Tank Corps as a result of the offensive with a limited purpose. Again, it appeared that the newly formed divisions, having no experience of use on the Eastern Front, have to pay for the lessons learned in the first time. In addition, the division commander, who moved forward to scout the terrain with his reconnaissance battalion, at the first contact with the enemy was wounded and out of action. Thus, the offensive of the division did not bring the expected success, the capture of the railroad junction Fastov. On the contrary, this first contact with the enemy in the east, not to mention the heavy losses, meant a mental shock for the personnel of the division, which the High Command had to avoid. Nevertheless, as a result of the strike, as well as the introduction of forces transferred by the 8th Army, it was possible to stop the enemy in the area south of Kiev and prevent further withdrawal of the front line back. On November 15th, 48 TK began to make the intended strike, which led to the fact that the enemy's tank corps, moving from Kiev to the southwest, the nearest target of the strike, were defeated. The 48th TK then turned westward and struck at the forces pursuing the 13th AK. Zhytomyr was again in our hands. The last planned strike of the corps to the east along the large highway Zhytomyr-Kiev in the rear of the enemy, located south of Kiev, was thwarted as a result of thawing. If, in this way, it was not possible to throw the enemy off the western bank of the Dnieper, it was still possible by the beginning of December to temporarily restore the position on the front of the 4th Tank Army. The army now occupied positions on the front north of the Dnieper, from a point 40 kilometers south of Kiev to the area north of Zhytomyr. Left isolated in the area of Korostan, the 49th SE again took Korostan, and thus restored the railroad connection with Army Group Center. According to a report from the headquarters of the 4th Tank Army, the enemy lost about 20,000 men killed. The fact that along with only 5,000 prisoners captured and destroyed 600 tanks, 300 guns and over 1,200 anti-tank guns, again testified to the fact that the technical equipment of the Soviet Army is improving all the time. 1/3 of all rifle divisions operating in the Kiev area, as well as 4 tank corps, 1 mechanized and 1 cavalry corps suffered heavy losses in these battles. Unfortunately, the rapid retreat of the corps of the 4th Panzer Army to the south and east, which took place at first, led Hitler to the conviction that the command of this army should be transferred to other hands. Despite my objection that the reason should be sought not in the poor management of the army, but in the fact that the superiority of the enemy and the weakness of our battered divisions inevitably had to lead to the loss of our positions on the Dnieper, Hitler said that Colonel General Goth, after 2 intense events of recent years, need a rest. Goth was transferred to the Führer's reserve. I was very sorry to see him go, but achieved at least a promise that he would receive the army in the west after his vacation. His successor was the former commander of the 6th TD and then 11 AC of our army group, the experienced General Pailly, who had previously served in the Austrian army. While the 4th Tank Army was still fighting, the enemy by mid-November had already recovered again from the defeat at Kryvyi Rog. He launched a major new offensive with fresh forces on the Dnieper bulge, striking at the northern section of the 1st Tank Army's front and the adjacent right flank of the 8th Army. He also attempted to cross the Dnieper in the eastern section of the front occupied by the 1st Tank Army south of Zaporozhye and attack the 8th Army's positions on the Dnieper on either side of Cherkasy. Later he expanded the offensive front, striking from the south at the bridgehead near Nikopol. The enemy's intention to finally encircle and destroy the 1st Tank Army in the eastern part of the Dnieper arc was obvious. The development of events in the second half of November forced the Army Command to address the OK on the issue of further operations. In our letter of November 20th, we proceeded from the fact that the enemy, despite the actions of its large forces in front of the Army Group, still has at its disposal large operational reserves. According to available information, 44 rifle divisions and a large number of tank brigades formed by the Soviets in 1944 have not yet been put into combat. In addition, 33 rifle divisions and 11 tank and mechanized corps are evidently behind the front line for additional manning. Apparently, it should be considered that the enemy will continue its offensive on the southern wing of the Eastern Front and during the winter. In this case, the main blow will be struck on the northern flank of the Army Group. Even in case of success of the counterattack, which we were at that moment on the site of the 4th Tank Army, the enemy west of the Dnieper will still have enough space to resume the offensive. As a consequence, it is under no circumstances possible to remove forces from the operationally decisive northern flank of the Army Group to use them in the Dnieper arc. Even if, despite this, it had been possible to achieve success in the defensive and temporarily stabilize the situation in battles with the enemy who has now taken the offensive, the following facts would have to be taken into account in operational terms. The Army Group would have to hold during the winter rather shabby divisions, a section of the front, for which its forces are far from sufficient. It would not have sufficient reserves to repel an offensive by large enemy forces, which could be undertaken in several areas. Army Group, therefore, will be in complete operational dependence on the enemy, which is particularly dangerous in connection with the reduced combat effectiveness of its formations. The fighting, which will be conducted depending on the enemy's intentions, cannot result in a serious weakening of his striking power. Since the Soviets will constantly dictate their will to us, and we will not be able to maneuver reserves in time to repel their blows or to preempt the enemy, we will not only give them a large space, but also suffer heavy losses in men and equipment. A prerequisite for the successful continuation of hostilities is the creation of sufficient and combat-ready reserves. If they cannot be allocated from the troops operating in other theatres of war, it is necessary to significantly reduce the front line on the right wing of the Eastern Front. Without reserves, Army Group cannot hold during the winter of their positions. By the end of November, on the southern wing of the Eastern Front, the situation was as follows. South of the lower reaches of the Don, the 6th Army withdrew its right flank behind the Dnieper, holding only one bridgehead near Kherson. The 17th Army was cut off in the Crimea and held the approaches to it. The bridgehead on the south bank of the Dnieper, in front of Nikopol, managed to hold throughout its entire length, although the 4th Ukrainian Front operating in the south put into action here its main forces' 18 divisions and large tank formations. On the outskirts of the Crimea and in the lower reaches of the Dnieper, the enemy has so far stopped its attacks. In the Dnieper arc, the enemy south of Zaporozhye in a small area forced the river and seized a narrow bridgehead. One tank army in defence achieved otherwise complete success. It is true that in some areas the enemy continuously attacking managed to somewhat squeeze our troops, but he nowhere managed to break through the front. However, these battles required the use of the last reserves of the army. At the end of November, it occupied a continuous front from the area north of Zaporozhye to the area northwest of Kryvyi Rog. Then the front turned northward to the junction with the 8th Army. A very difficult situation developed on the front of the 8th Army, which is not the least explained by the transfer of 4 motorized and 1 infantry division to the 4th Tank Army in connection with the situation at the beginning of November near Kiev. The enemy managed to seize the area south of the Dnieper near Kremenchug and to advance upstream here, capturing the crossing at Kremenchug. In addition, southwest of Kremenchug, although in a narrow area, he wedged into the positions of the army facing the front to the east. In the northern section of the 8th Army near the Dnieper, the enemy managed to force the river on both sides of Cherkasy. Since the army had no more reserves, it was forced to abandon its positions on the bank of the Dnieper on a front of 100 km, entrenching itself in a new, albeit very weak position behind a swampy stretch of terrain on the bank of the river flowing 50 km south of the Dnieper. Although Army Group transferred 2 motorized divisions from the 1st and 4th Panzer Armies to the 8th Army as soon as the situation allowed, it was doubtful whether the 8th Army would be able to dislodge the enemy wedged in its eastern section and restore the position at Cherkasy. This example shows that the Army Group was often forced to move mechanized formations from place to place. An attempt to restore the situation in one area by transferring to it mechanized formations from another area inevitably led to the creation of a difficult situation on the front of the army, which had to give these formations. In any case, at the end of November, the Dnieper from the area north of Zaporozhye to the area west of Cherkasy and further from the area south of Kiev to the area of Army Group Center was in the hands of the enemy. On the northern flank of the Army Group, in the area of operations of the 4th Tank Army, the situation after the successful counterattack of the 48th Tank Army was temporarily diffused. It could not be doubted, however, that the enemy only wanted to concentrate forces here again in order to strike a decisive blow deep into the flank of the Army Group. Despite this, the need to continue the fight in the Dnieper arc led to the transfer of the above-mentioned 2 mechanized formations of the 8th Army. 4 Tank Army in early December, its right flank still stood on the Dnieper 24 TK, which was part of it, above the crossing at Kanav, adjoined the left flank of the 8th Army. A little south of Kiev, its front turned sharply westward from the Dnieper and, representing a continuous line, passed to the area north of Zhytomyr. Away from this front, in the vicinity of Korostan, was the front to the east of the 59th Army. Throughout December, the Soviets tried to achieve decisive success in the Dnieper bulge. Only short pauses, necessary for the enemy to replace the battle-worn formations with fresh ones or to introduce new forces into the battle, interrupted his attacks on this far-reaching bastion to the east. In these attacks, he undoubtedly suffered heavy losses. In the Dnieper bulge itself, the 3rd Ukrainian Front, which was continuously throwing into the battle on the northern section of the 1st Tank Army significantly superior to our forces, could not achieve any success. At the same time, the 2nd Ukrainian Front launched an offensive with the forces of at least 6 armies and 1 tank army with the task of crushing the left flank of the 1st Tank Army and the east-facing front of the 8th Army. The enemy apparently intended, by bringing into battle large forces of tanks in the area northwest of Kryvyi Rog, to break the front at the junction between the 2 German armies in the southwestern direction. Then he was going to make another strike in the direction of the lower reaches of the Dnieper River in order to encircle the 1st Tank Army in the eastern part of the Dnieper arc. Another direction of the main blow in this offensive was planned in the northern section of the east-facing front of the 8th Army south of the Dnieper. Together with the later planned strike from the bridgehead captured near Cherkasy, this offensive was obviously aimed at encircling the 8th Army. At the same time, the 4th Ukrainian Front, with the forces of 3 armies, began an offensive from the south on the bridgehead near Nikopol, thus striking in the rear of the 1st Tank Army. While here the enemy's attacks were repulsed, it was, however, inevitable that the offensive of the 2nd Ukrainian Front, which had an overwhelming superiority of forces, aimed at the left flank of the 1st Tank Army, would lead to some success for the Soviets also on the front of the 8th Army. Twice the enemy managed to realize a deep breakthrough on the above-mentioned directions of the main blow. As a result, our front between the area of Kryvyi Rog and the Dnieper began to gradually move back. In both cases, the Army Group Command succeeded, however, at the cost of a dangerous weakening of those areas that were not threatened at the moment, to concentrate a tank corps of several divisions in the threatened area, which counterattacks stopped the breakthrough troops and prevented them from developing their success on an operational scale. In these heavy battles inevitably fell combat effectiveness of German formations. Infantry compounds were continuously in battle. Tank compounds, like a fire department, thrown from one section of the front to another. Of course, the enemy's losses in manpower during continuous attacks many times exceeded our losses, but he could make up for them. All appeals of the army group to the general command about the fact that here, on the Dnieper bulge, our forces are spent on the operationally unfavourable direction, did not yield significant results. OK did not have the necessary replenishment for us in men and equipment to compensate for losses, and from Hitler could not get an order to leave this bastion in time to save forces and free them for the much more important in operational terms of the northern flank of the army group. All the warnings that even the successes we achieved in the defence of the Dnieper arc cannot for a long time to ensure the First Tank Army from encirclement, as the enemy is always pulling up here new forces, remained ineffective. The same fate befell our proposals that it is necessary to reduce the front line in the south, and through this to create reserves. In the end, as mentioned above, there was nothing else to do but to throw on the Dnieper arc 2 divisions, which could be much better used on the northern flank of the army group. Only when the situation on the northern flank of the army group was difficult, Hitler, but even then still with hesitation, realized where operational success was to be decided. As a reason for holding the Dnieper arc, Hitler still pointed to the importance of Nikopol and the Crimea for the conduct of the war. He still did not give up the hope that after the successful repulsion of enemy attacks, in the Dnieper arc can be struck in a southerly direction to re-establish contact with the Crimean grouping. Along with this, apparently, he also hoped that the enemy would exhaust his offensive impulse if he, as at Moscow in 1941, demanded that the troops defend every inch of ground. Every time he was asked to reduce the front, he used the argument that in this case the enemy would be freed up. This, of course, could not be disputed. But Hitler at the same time deliberately did not want to see that the offensive can exhaust its forces, attacking defensive positions, in the case that they are occupied by large forces. Any attempt to hold the front line, which is occupied by troops about the same as the guard line, should lead to the fact that two weak forces of the defender will be very quickly depleted, or the enemy simply knock them out of these positions. On the army group's northern flank, the aforementioned strikes of 48 TK of 4 Tank Army resulted in a temporary lull. However, there was no doubt that the enemy here would again take the offensive as soon as he recouped his losses. The task of the 4th Tank Army was to delay this moment if possible and further weaken the enemy. Since the army now occupied with its main forces a position facing north, between the Dnieper and the area north of Zhytomyr, there was still, in addition, the danger of bypassing its western flank. The isolated 59 AC standing near Korosteny could not prevent this. The forces of the army were by no means sufficient to throw the enemy off the western bank of the Dnieper as a result of the Kiev offensive. Army Group Command therefore wanted to at least try to secure the western flank of 4 Panzer Army to some extent. In addition, it was desirable to hold in their hands as long as possible the initiative we received as a result of the actions of 48 TK. Therefore, the Group Command set the task for the 4th Tank Army to use the situation that currently existed on the open western flank in the area of Zhytomyr-Korostan to make new strikes with a limited purpose. On his instructions, 48 TK was again released from the section of the army facing the front to the north. Carefully camouflaged and making false maneuvers, moving only at night, it moved to the open western flank of the enemy's 60th Army north of Zhytomyr. The sudden blow that followed forced the army to retreat to the east. Its compounds suffered heavy losses. Immediately after that, the Corps struck another blow to the enemy group concentrated southeast of Korostan, as a result of which at least 3 mechanized corps were defeated. Thus, in the end, it was possible not only to partially break the troops accumulating for a new offensive in the area ahead of the Dnieper, but also to take control of the area in front of the left flank of the 4th Tank Army. Still, it was clear that on this flank of the army group is again going to thunderstorm. On December 24th, it broke out. The first reports of the beginning of the enemy offensive on both sides of the highway Kiev-Zhytomyr I received while in the 20 Morty, located behind the threatened section of the front in reserve. I wanted to attend the Christmas party in its regiments. At first, the reports did not contain particularly alarming information. Only on the front of the 25th TD, operating south of the highway Kiev-Zhytomyr, the matter seemed to take a bad turn. Evening reports received by me on my return to our headquarters in Vinnytsia, however, already showed that the enemy was trying to break through in the direction of Zhytomyr. In the following days, the situation developed as follows. The First Ukrainian Front, which was operating in the Kiev area, concentrated very large forces west of the city to break through on a wide front along the highway to Zhytomyr and south of it. The 38th, 1st Guards and 1st Tank Armies with over 18 rifle divisions and 6 tank and mechanized corps operated in this main strike group. Subsequently, the 18th Army also became noted in this group. To the south, this main offensive was supplemented by the 40th Soviet Army's strike on Fastov. On the northern flank was advancing 60th Army, which we recently struck. It was replenished. Further to the north in the direction of Korostan was the 13th Army, which had no less than 14 rifle divisions and 1 cavalry corps. These compounds, however, were badly damaged as a result of our strikes. Particularly dangerous was the fact that behind this army apparently concentrated the 3rd Guards Tank Army of at least 6 tank and mechanized corps. 3 to 4 corps of this army, it is true, were badly battered in the past battles. But the Hydra too quickly grew new heads. In any case, the concentration of these mobile corps testified to the intention of the enemy command to supplement the breakthrough to Zhytomyr with a deep coverage through Korostan. Although behind the area where the main blow was struck, the command was concentrated here in the hands of the recently introduced in this area headquarters of the 42nd Army in the vicinity of Zhytomyr was in combat readiness 48 TK with 2 combat-ready tank divisions, 168 PD and 18 artillery division. It was still unclear whether these forces would be sufficient to repel the enemy's blow. In terms of their numbers, exceeded them many times. Even if it was possible, there would not be enough forces to eliminate the threat of an enemy breakthrough through Korostan with the subsequent capture of the northern flank of the Army Group. 25th December Army Group Command therefore sent a telegram to the Oak, which outlined the general situation and the conclusions that needed to be made. It was stated that the 4th Tank Army will not be able to stop the enemy offensive with the forces that are now at its disposal. It will thus not be able to fulfill its task to cover the deep flank of Army Groups South and A. It must be significantly strengthened. If the OK has no forces at its disposal for this purpose, the command of the group will be forced to remove from its right flank at least 5 or 6 divisions. In this case, the enemy obviously will no longer be able to hold their positions in the Dnieper arc. Therefore, the Army Command requests permission to decide at its discretion on its right flank. At the same time, the 4th Tank Army was assigned the task with all available forces to stop the enemy striking its main strike group to Zhytomyr in the area of action of the 42nd Army in order to make a breakthrough. With its northern flank, it should act so as not to allow the enemy to turn his troops and strike at Zhytomyr. The 17th Panzer Division, which operated as part of the 6th Army, already released from the area of the lower Dnieper River, was transferred to the 4th Panzer Army. To the requests of the OK, aimed at achieving half-hearted solutions in the area of the Dnieper Arc, the command reported the moment to save the situation on the northern flank of the Army Group by private measures, such as the transfer of individual divisions missed. Judging by the number of forces thrown here by the enemy in the battle, we reported further, even if it is possible to temporarily stop the advancing enemy, we will not be able to achieve a fundamental change in the situation. In addition, it is clear that the enemy will throw into the offensive all new reserves accumulated by him this winter. The situation is so that in the coming weeks in the area Korostan, Zhytomyr, Berdychov, Vinnytsia south of Kiev, the enemy can cut our rear communications and then throw our troops to the southwest. To avoid this danger, it was further said, it is necessary to take decisive measures. The situation at the moment is similar to the situation on the front of the Army Group in the winter of 1942/43, in that now it is also necessary to move from the right flank of the Army Group to the left flank of the 1st Tank Army. This way is currently the only way to restore the situation. 1 Tank Army must be released from the Dnieper Arc and from its composition of at least 5 or 6 divisions should be transferred to the area of Berdychov. This can be achieved only by withdrawal from the eastern part of the Dnieper Arc and withdrawal of the front line to the already prepared positions on the boundary of the Dnieper bend west of Nikolaev Krivoy Rog. Due to the reduction of the front achieved in this way, it will be possible to free 12 divisions. 6 of them, as indicated above, should be transferred together with the headquarters of the 1st Tank Army to the northern flank of the army group. The rest should remain subordinate to the 6th Army, which will also be transferred to the Strip, which was previously occupied by the 1st Tank Army, to organize the defense along the lower Dnieper. The units of the 1st Tank Army, transferred to the northern flank of the army group, can strike from the east at the enemy troops advancing on Zhytomyr. In addition, OK should transfer to the 4th Tank Army for use on its northern flank additional forces to eliminate here the threat of coverage of its troops. In the future, these forces can be used to strike from the west at the main enemy strike group in parallel with the advance of the 1st Tank Army. The current situation on the Dnieper arc, where enemy attacks have recently weakened, allows to undertake this regrouping without great risk. The proposed withdrawal of the front line, however, may be fraught with difficulties if we wait until the enemy launches an offensive here. In this connection, and in view of the situation on the front of the 4th Panzer Army, it is necessary that the General Command make a decision quickly. When, despite our urgent requests, until December 28th, Hitler had not yet made a decision on our proposal, but only promised to transfer 4 Panzer Army several divisions, the command on December 29th issued the appropriate orders. The command of the 1st Panzer Army was ordered by January 1st to transfer the section occupied by it to the 6th Army, and no later than January 3rd to accept from the 4th Panzer Army the section of the front occupied by the 4th Panzer Army from the Dnieper to the area located about 45 km southeast of Berdychov. Behind the left flank of this section was to concentrate 3 TK consisting of 4 divisions, which were to arrive here from the Dnieper bulge, as well as from the 6th Army. Then a few more divisions would be sent here. If the transfer of the 1st Tank Army started by the army group did not provide for the movement of large forces, it was due to limited transportation capabilities. It was also due to the fact that the group command could not order the abandonment of the eastern part of the Dnieper arc without the consent of Hitler, as it would directly affect the position of Army Group A. Even such an authority as the Army Group Command is limited in making independent decisions and needs the consent of the High Command, where the sphere of its competence begins the coordination of operations on the scale of the entire front. In the area left behind the 4th Tank Army were to be transferred forces allocated by the OK. Whether these forces would be sufficient to carry out the planned counterattacks of these 2 groups on the flanks of the enemy, whose main forces were advancing to the southwest, was unclear, while it was necessary to stop his advance. December 30th, the group headquarters reported to the OK on the measures taken by him. December 31st, Hitler retroactively gave his consent. However, he evaded the much-needed decision to abandon the eastern part of the Dnieper arc, and thus the Nikopol bridgehead. While in accordance with the order of the group command began the transfer of forces, the situation at the site of the 4th Tank Army by December 31st was still threatening. The main forces of the enemy managed to make a breakthrough on a wide front to the southwest in the direction of Vinnytsia. The 4th Tank Army in the area south of Kiev, however, still held its positions, but was forced to bend back its western flank. In the area where it was planned to concentrate the 3rd Tank Army, there was a gap in the front up to 75 km wide. Only 45 km southeast of Berdychov again began occupied by very small forces of the front of the 4th Tank Army, which passed mainly directly east of the road Berdychov-Zhytomyr and again ended north of this city. In the vicinity of Zhytomyr, the front to the east and north acted 13 AC. Between it and 59 AC, thrown back to the area west of Korostan, again gaping gap front width of 75 km, in the depth of which was to concentrate 26 TK. Fortunately, the enemy forces were tied up in battles with the isolated groups of troops of the 4th Tank Army mentioned above. The enemy had not yet seen, or in any case, did not fully utilize the opportunities provided to its mobile formations due to the presence of these gaps to strike at rear communications or to encircle isolated groups of troops of the 4th Tank Army. In early January, the general situation on the front of the army group deteriorated greatly. In the Dnieper arc, as well as in the area of the Nikopol bridgehead, planned a new enemy offensive against the 6th and 8th Armies. If it would have begun before the proposal of the army group would have been left in the eastern part of the Dnieper arc, the situation on this flank would have been threatening. First of all, then it would not have been possible to release the tank divisions, which were scheduled to be transferred to the section of the 1st Tank Army on the northern flank, which had already been ordered. Indeed, on January 3rd began a major enemy offensive east of Kirovograd. Both divisions were drawn into the battle. More and more urgent was the need to transfer forces to the northern flank of the army group. The enemy by this time has already realized what prospects for him open in connection with the presence of gaps in our front. On the new section of the 1st Tank Army, which on January 3rd took the section south and southwest of Kiev, the enemy struck a blow to the south, coming to the area about 50 km north of Uman. Here the advanced units of the 3rd TK that arrived here managed to stop it temporarily. Especially critical was the situation in the area of the 4th Tank Army. Under the threat of being covered by both flanks, by January 4th it was forced to withdraw to a position starting 60 km east of Vinnytsia and going north in the direction of Berdychov, ending 60 km west of the city on the former Soviet-Polish border. In the large front gap between our Army Group and Army Group Centre, starting further north, the 59th AK withdrew along the big road Zhytomyr-Rivny, and north of it also to the former Soviet-Polish border. The development of events in the first days of January forced me to fly to the Führer's headquarters on January 4th to finally obtain Hitler's permission to move large forces from the right flank of the army group to the left. I began by characterizing to him the new danger arising in the Dnieper arc, as well as the extremely critical situation on the site of the 4th Panzer Army. Then I explained to him in detail our plan to attack the enemy advancing on the front of this army from the flanks, the forces of 3 TK1 Tank Army from the east, and the forces of 26 TK transferred behind the northern flank of 4 Tank Army from the northwest. I immediately told Hitler that the planned counterattacks at best temporarily eliminate the looming threat, but in no case cannot strengthen for the long-term position on the northern flank of the army group. The entire southern flank of the Eastern Front is in mortal danger if the position on the northern flank of the army group cannot be restored. Army Group South and Army Group will find themselves then in Romania or the Black Sea. If, therefore, the High Command cannot put at our disposal large forces, the withdrawal of the southern flank of Army Group to release the forces needed for the decisive northern flank, which of course will entail the surrender of Nikopol, can no longer be postponed. I would like to add here that the abandonment of the eastern part of the Dnieper arc, in the opinion of the Army Group Command, was only the first step towards the transfer of the main efforts to the northern flank of the Army Group, which was the only appropriate to the general situation. In order to carry out such a regrouping on the necessary large scale, it was necessary to significantly reduce the front in the south. Army Group Command, therefore, prudently already ordered a reconnaissance and the beginning of the equipment of the defensive position to the west of the occupied front line, which of course was known to Hitler. This position ran from the lower reaches of the Bug River in a general north and northwesterly direction, taking advantage of convenient river frontiers, to the southern boundary of the area in which the northern flank of the army group was currently engaged in fierce fighting. The occupation of this line would mean a reduction by about half of the front of the 6th and 8th Armies, which as a result of holding the Dnieper arc stretched it to 900 kilometers. Such a significant reduction of the front and the associated large savings of forces will finally give the opportunity to concentrate the necessary number of forces on the northern flank. Despite this, the southern flank would retain enough forces to hold the above-mentioned line even against significantly superior enemy forces. Of course, the enemy would have released forces as well. However, a reduced and sufficiently provided with troops front in the south, on which it would be possible to create a stable defence, even with massive enemy attacks, could prove that defence is stronger than offensive. On the other hand, the enemy, due to the fact that we will destroy the railroad network, is unlikely to be able to transfer forces from its southern flank to the area west of Kiev to the same extent, and at the same pace to achieve here the superiority of its forces. Naturally, only the abandonment of the Dnieper arc would create the prerequisite for such a significant withdrawal of forces on the southern flank of the German army. To ask for it Hitler now would be completely inappropriate. He was not the kind of man who sees the need for distant calculation in the conduct of operations. Moreover, he even now rejected any thought of abandoning the Dnieper arc to release the forces that were to be transferred to the northern flank of the army group, as well as the surrender of Nikopol. He stated on this occasion that the subsequent inevitable abandonment of the Crimea would mean the withdrawal from us of Turkey and then Bulgaria and Romania. He went on to say that he was unable to give the Army Group additional forces for its northern flank. He could take them from Army Group North, but only on condition of its withdrawal to Lake Pipsi, which in turn would mean the departure of Finland from us. As a result, we would lose our dominance over the eastern region of the Baltic Sea and the possibility of bringing ore from Sweden. In addition, we would thus lose the area necessary for submarine maneuvers. From the west, Hitler can move to us forces only when the enemy's attempt to land on the coast will be eliminated, or if the British, as he thinks, will land in Portugal. He must now fight to gain time until the situation in the west will not be clarified, until the formations he is now forming will not come into operation. From May, in addition, again will be intensively conducted submarine warfare. In the enemy's camp, further, there are so many contradictions that this camp will one day disintegrate. Hence, the main thing is to gain time. He sees the danger that threatens the Army Group as well as we do, but he must take this risk until he has more forces at his disposal. It was utterly pointless to try to refute these arguments of Hitler. He could, as was usual in such cases, object to me that I could not judge these matters because I was deprived of a general perspective. I had only to point out again and again the gravity of the situation on our northern flank and emphasize that the countermeasures taken by the group can, by no means, lead to the final overcoming of the danger. It is necessary to transfer by any means as soon as possible behind the northern flank of the Army Group another new army, concentrating it in the area of Rovno, to eliminate the threat of coverage by large enemy forces. Since in such a wide circle, in what usually took place reports on the situation, further discussion with Hitler did not promise success, I asked permission to talk to him only in the presence of the Chief of the General Staff. With obvious displeasure, incredulously waiting for what I would now present to him, Hitler gave his consent. Representatives of the OKB, Göring adjutants, Hitler's secretaries, and both stenographers disappeared. The latter usually had to write down every word spoken during these situation reports. Since there were no maps in front of them, it is true that they often could not understand at all what was being said. I flew to the Führer's headquarters with the purpose, along with the question of the situation on the front of the Army Group, to once again raise the question of the overall leadership of military operations in this war. After all present, except for General Zeitzler, left, I asked Hitler for permission to speak quite openly. In an icy tone, frowning, Hitler replied, "Please." I began with the following words: "We must clearly realize, my Führer, that the extremely critical situation in which we now find ourselves is not only due to the undeniable superiority of the enemy. It is also a consequence of the way in which our military leadership is being conducted." As I said these words, Hitler's face began to take on a tense expression. He stared at me with a look that said one thing: now he wants to suppress your will, to silence you. I don't recall ever having seen a look that so conveyed the strength of a man's will. One of the ambassadors accredited in Berlin in his memoirs describes the impression Hitler made on him at their first meeting. In his description, he particularly emphasizes the influence of Hitler's eyes. It was on him that they made a very strong positive impression at that time. In his face, endowed with rough features, only the eyes were something attractive, at least the most expressive. Now he stared at me with those eyes, as if he wanted to make my opponent fall down with his gaze. I thought of the snake charmer of India. It was, so to speak, a silent struggle. Lasting for a few seconds, I realized that by the look of his eyes he had intimidated, or, to use a vulgar but appropriate expression for the occasion, nailed more than one of his victims. However, I went on and told him that the way we have organized the leadership of the armed forces, nothing good will come out of it. I have to go back to my proposal, which I have outlined twice already. What he needs for the general direction of military operations is one, but really responsible Chief of the General Staff, on whose advice he could rely for the direction of military operations. If this proposal is accepted for the Eastern Front, as is already the case in Italy and in the West, it is necessary to appoint one commander, who should have within the framework of the general direction of military operations full autonomy. Just as on both previous occasions, when I told Hitler about the need for fundamental changes in his methods of directing military operations, and this time he took my proposals sharply negative. Hitler stated that only he, possessing all the means of state power, can effectively direct military action. Only he is able to decide what forces can be allocated to individual theatres of war, and thus how on them to conduct operations. Göring will also never submit to the instructions of another person. As for the appointment of the commander of the Eastern Theatre of Operations, he again uttered the words already once quoted by me, that no one else has such authority as he. Even I am not subject to field marshals. Do you not think that to you they will be more subject? If necessary, I can remove them from their posts. No one else can have such authority, he shouted in my face. My reply that the orders I would give would be carried out, he left unheeded, and that was the end of our conversation. Again failed my attempt to influence Hitler nicely, so that he would agree to changes in the organization of our high command, which, without affecting his prestige, would meet military necessity. The fact that he did not want, even if not even formally, but in fact, to put the leadership of military operations in the hands of a representative of the army, probably, on the one hand, was due to his excessive faith in himself. He did not want to admit, even in private, that he had made a mistake or needed advice on military matters. The distrust which induced the dictator to keep the army in his own hands, just in case, also played a part. It was clear to me, however, that any attempt to bring about the undoubtedly necessary changes by force would lead to disaster at the front. The thought that the Russians would then penetrate into Germany as much excluded for me the path of force, as did the thought of the Anglo-American demand for unconditional surrender. Thus I had to return without having accomplished anything either as regards relief for the army group or as regards a reasonable settlement of the question of our high command. However, this in no way meant that we gave up the struggle to finally obtain freedom of manoeuvre for our flank in the Dnieper arc, and to strengthen the northern flank of our army group. Due to the negative results of negotiations in the Führer's Stavka for the army group, had no choice but to continue the fight in the Dnieper arc. On its northern flank, it was necessary to act so as to thwart the enemy's attempts to encircle the 4th Panzer Army and break through in a southerly direction, as a result of which the rear communications of the southern flank would be cut. The enemy with unrelenting force throughout January continued in the Dnieper arc attacks on the positions that we still had to hold. With particular force, he attacked the eastern section of the 8th Army. But also in the area now occupied by the 6th Army, the troops had to continuously repel enemy attacks. They were conducted both in the direction of the positions located in the Dnieper arc, the front to the north, and from the south against the Nikopol bridgehead. If our front during January was able to hold, not only in the area of the Nikopol bridgehead, but also in the Dnieper arc, it is due to the dedication of the German troops, the simple German soldier. His exploits during these continuous heavy defensive battles are not describable at all. The German soldier was here a symbol of loyalty, sense of duty, obedience and service to Germany. Thanks to such actions of the German troops, as well as the ingenuity of the command of both armies, the successes of the enemy, far superior to us in men and equipment in this area, were still insignificant. True, the 8th Army was somewhat pushed westward. Kirovograd was taken. However, the enemy was still unable to make a breakthrough to encircle our troops in the Dnieper arc. On the left flank of the army group, the situation was extremely difficult. The fact that the 4th Tank Army could not offer strong resistance to the onslaught of superior enemy forces and surrendered Berdichov, and the same withdrew to create a continuous front, at least in most of its section, further west and southwest, was not the most dangerous. Much more dangerous was the fact that the enemy, by about January 6th, the enemy realized what great chances of success he could gain by exploiting the break in the front line between 1 Tank Army and the right flank of 4 Tank Army, as well as the large gap created between 4 Tank Army and Army Group Center. Only the isolated weak 59 AC, which was retreating with the battles on Rovno, was operating in this area. It was clear that the Russians suspended the offensive on the front of the 4th Tank Army to take their chances on its exposed flanks. With the forces of 3 armies, the enemy now sought to defeat the northern flank of the 4th Tank Army, while the 60th and 13th Armies of the Russian moved further north, carrying out a parallel pursuit in the direction of Rovno. At the same time, the enemy continued to advance southward through the gap between the 1st and 4th Tank Armies. His advanced detachments reached the area 30 km north of Uman, which was the supply base of the 1st Tank Army, as well as on the outskirts of Vinnytsia, where the headquarters of the army group was located earlier. A few days before that he was transferred to Proskurov, because the communication lines from Vinnytsia to the right flank of the army group were threatened by the enemy offensive. The enemy tanks even managed to temporarily block the most important supply route of the army group, near Zhemarinka. The army group command could choose two ways in connection with the situation. Was it to prevent the further advance of the enemy towards the almost open northern flank of the army group, which entailed the danger of a deep bypass of its northern flank? Or was it more important to prevent the enemy from finally breaking through the gap between the 1st and 4th Tank Armies? In order to solve both of these tasks at the same time, there were not enough forces. We decided to eliminate the second danger first. It was currently more threatening. If the enemy was given the opportunity to enter this gap large forces and strike south through the upper reaches of the Bug, the 8th and 6th Armies would be in danger of encirclement. Further enemy advance toward the northern flank of Army Group on Rivne could only later acquire a threatening character. Here the forces that Hitler would sooner or later be forced to move here, in the end, would have to save the situation. If, however, both armies of the southern flank found themselves surrounded, it would be impossible to get them out of there. On the only correct decision to significantly push back the front line on the southern flank of the army group to release forces capable of overcoming the crisis on the northern flank, Hitler still vetoed. Based on these considerations, we decided to concentrate first all the forces at our disposal to strike at the enemy advancing through the gap between 1 and 4 Panzer armies to the south. This gap was especially dangerous because the enemy's breakthrough in the direction of Uman forced the 1st Tank Army to bend its western flank in the area southwest of Kiev to the south. It was now in contact with the rear positions of the 8th Army located in the Dnieper arc. Since the inner flanks of both armies still held the Dnieper on either side of Kiev, the German positions formed, so to speak, a sack that was tied up in the north at the Dnieper, while its longitudinal sides represented the east and west facing fronts of both armies. If the enemy had succeeded in exploiting the gap north of Uman, it would have been easy for him to tighten this sack in the south. The sensible thing to do, of course, would be to withdraw from it, since it would have been pointless to spend a lot of forces on its defense. But even here Hitler did not want to voluntarily cede the Dnieper coast. He still hoped to strike from this bulge of the front in order to someday again seize the eastern part of the arc. Therefore this protrusion remained. After a short time, this sack turned into the Cherkasy cauldron. Army Group headquarters planned to strike at the enemy advancing deep into the gap between the 4th and 1st Tank Armies from 3 sides, taking the enemy in pincers. From the east, from the location of 1 Tank Army 7AC, was striking the enemy in the flank. The Corps was released from the above-mentioned front protrusion due to the fact that by order of the group command on the Dnieper were left only weak cover. As a result of this 7AC, at least, did not fall then in the Cherkasy cauldron. From the west 46 TK was to strike at the other flank of the enemy. He at that moment was still just approaching from France. From the south struck released by the group of armies from the Dnieper arc 3 TK. Its task was to maneuvering, delaying and restraining the enemy until the 2 other corps will not concentrate to attack. In the second half of January, counterattack was made. True, the small number of forces at our disposal forced us to conduct it in 2 stages, as the gap between the 4 and 1 Tank Armies during this time increased to almost 75 km. The first strike was made by 7AC and 3 TK in the eastern part of this gap on the 40th Army of the enemy. Then also by concentric blow of 3 TK and 26 TK, in which took part, besides tank divisions of 1 PD, 4 GSD and 18 AID, in the western part of the gap were surrounded and defeated large forces of the Soviet 1 Tank Army. As a result of the last strike, I do not have data regarding the first strike. At the moment the enemy lost, along with 8,000 killed, only 5,500 prisoners, 700 tanks, over 200 guns, and about 500 anti-tank guns. Our troops during these battles damaged 14 rifle divisions and 5 tank and mechanized corps. However, the enemy certainly managed to withdraw at least part of the people from the encirclement. While all this was going on, negotiations continued between the group command and the OK regarding the course of further operations. Repeatedly, the group command emphasized that it is necessary, finally, to give the right flank of the army group freedom of maneuver, that is, to abandon the intention to hold the Dnieper arc, which has long been operationally erroneous. In a letter sent to Hitler through the Chief of the General Staff, I dwelt on the arguments given by Hitler on January 4th to justify the need to hold the Dnieper arc. I wrote that the position of Turkey, Bulgaria and Romania does not depend so much on whether we hold the Crimea as on the presence of a combat-ready right flank of German troops in front of the eastern borders of the two latter states. Group Command again emphasized that the development of events on the entire southern flank of the Eastern Front is determined by whether a large army will be timely advanced behind the left flank of the army group in the area of Rovno. This can be achieved by releasing forces from the right flank of the army group as a result of its withdrawal to a reduced front, or by transferring the compounds of Army Group North, or the evacuation of the army from the Crimea. Only if we timely concentrate this army in the area of Rovno, it will be possible to prevent a deep coverage of the northern flank of the army group, and thus the withdrawal of the entire southern flank of the Eastern Front to Romania. While the Chief of the General Staff of the Land Forces was quite in agreement with our proposal and tried to get Hitler to accept it, the latter stubbornly remained in his position of hold at all costs. From him it was impossible to obtain operational guidance on how further operations should be conducted in general, not just today. Such direction of operations was all the more intolerable because, in the opinion of the OK, the enemy still had large reserves, and the possibility of using them sooner or later would have to be reckoned with. How was it possible to fight intelligently when Hitler did not tell even the commanders of the army groups how he imagines in general terms the continuation of hostilities? How should, under these circumstances, if the said enemy reserves really exist, have taken into account in advance the possibility of their introduction into the battle? I have described this intolerable position in the letter quoted below. The management of troops, if it aims to achieve success, must consist of a well-organized interaction of the various command authorities, based on clear instructions from the command and a correct assessment of the situation. The Army Group Command cannot think within the limits of a single day. It cannot dispense with the indication that it is necessary to hold everything. If it sees that the further course of enemy operations may lead to the envelopment of our troops, which in turn will lead to a decisive success of the enemy, the command will have nothing to oppose the enveloping grouping. Therefore, I ask that the OK the necessary conclusions from the letters I sent earlier, containing an assessment of the situation, or point out where the Group Command is wrong in assessing the situation in the near future. If, however, to our proposals, made on the basis of the conclusions reached by the Army Group Command, based on the data available to it, the General Command not only will not listen, but will remain silent, then the interaction of the command authorities is out of the question. When this letter was not followed by any response, I wrote a long personal letter to Hitler himself. In it, I once again clearly outlined the situation of the army group, the operational capabilities of the enemy, as well as the state in which the troops are. I explicitly made it clear how, in my opinion, events will develop if we do not act in the spirit of the proposals of the army group. I particularly emphasized the urgent need to concentrate in the near future a large force behind the northern flank of the army group in order to prevent a clearly planned bypass of this flank, which would have far-reaching consequences. In connection with this necessity, as well as the danger threatened thereafter by the encirclement of the southern flank of the army group in the Dnieper arc, I wrote in conclusion. I will allow myself, my Führer, to conclude with the following words for us. It is now not a question of avoiding danger, but of meeting imminent danger in such a way as to overcome it. This letter was destined to play a few days later some role during my confrontation with Hitler. On January 27th, Hitler assembled all the commanders of the Eastern Front associations and many other officers in high positions in the Führer's Stavka. He wished himself to make us a report on the need for National Socialist education in the army. The more difficult the situation at the front became, the more importance he attached to faith in the final victory. This faith began to play a major role for him in the selection of commanders for positions from division commander and above. Already, by the way Hitler greeted me at lunch, preceding the report, it was obvious that he did not forgive me criticism. which was contained in my remarks on the leadership of military action, made on January 4th. In his report, he dared to throw in the face of the highest officers of the land forces who had so much merit approximately the following words: if ever it is necessary to fight to the end. After all, obviously, the field marshals and generals will have to be the last to stand in defense of the banner. I am not in the habit of listening to insults in silence. Hitler's words, however, should have been perceived by every soldier as a deliberate challenge to the highest officers of the army, which in the form of a rhetorical question questioned their courage and desire to fulfill their soldierly duty to the end. All those present were accustomed, as soldiers, to listen to their superior's speech in silence, and therefore remained silent. But I perceived the hidden insult in Hitler's words so strongly that the blood rushed to my head. When Hitler repeated his remark once more to emphasize it, I interrupted him by exclaiming, "So it will be, my Führer." This rejoinder, of course, had nothing to do with my personal attitude toward the National Socialist regime or toward Hitler. It was only meant to show that we would not allow such a challenge to be thrown in our faces, even by Hitler. As I was told later, my comrades breathed a sigh of relief at that moment, for they took Hitler's words in exactly the same way as I did. Hitler, however, apparently had never yet had to listen to a rejoinder during his speech, which he delivered as head of state, and in this case as Supreme Commander-in-Chief. The years of hearing rejoinders at meetings were far behind him. He had clearly lost the thread of his speech and shouted loudly to me, although I was sitting only a few feet away from him, "I thank you." Field Marshal von Manstein. At this he cut short his speech, rather abruptly. When I was drinking tea at General Zeitzler's, there was a telephone call, and I was told that Hitler wanted to talk to me in the presence of Keitel. He received me with the words, "Mr. Field Marshal, I forbid you to interrupt me during the speech which I hold before the generals. Obviously you yourself would not allow your subordinates to do so. About the last remark I had nothing to say." I took Hitler's words to heart. But then he, obviously being very angry, made a mistake. He continued, "However, you sent me a few days ago a report note on the situation. It obviously has a purpose, having gotten into the log of hostilities, sometime later to vindicate you before history. This was already too much. I objected. The letters that I send to you personally, of course, are not recorded in the combat log. This letter I sent with a courier through the Chief of the General Staff. I will ask you to excuse me if I now use an English word. In regard to your words, I can only say I am a gentleman's silence." After a pause, Hitler said thank you during the evening debriefing, to which I had been specially summoned. Hitler behaved toward me again very kindly. He even wished to hear my advice on the possibility of the defense of the Crimea, which reported to him present commander of the 17th Army, General Jinik. I was sure, however, that he had not forgiven me for my reply. However, there were things that bothered me more at the time than the way the Supreme Commander-in-Chief treated me. During the month of February, our attention was centered on 3 areas, which were named Nikopol, Cherkasy, and Rovno.